attention to the news, you've certainly heard about cases of drug-resistant tuberculosis, a big problem in developing countries. But also there are a number of bacterial infections, forms of bacteria that are dangerous to humans that have also developed resistance to drugs. So tonight we'll be learning about the various types of bacteria, how they become resistant, what types of antibiotics we've developed to fight them, what happens when we use these antibiotics and more resistance develops, how we manage the use of antibiotics to make them effective, what about the use of antibiotics in animals, what about the presence of resistant bacteria, which were first a problem in hospitals and now are a problem spread out to prisons, to schools, and to virtually everywhere. The one thing you probably all know, and I understand that many of you are actually students who are doing this in your courses, and others of you probably also have some expertise in this, but as you know, the room is full of bacteria, most of which you brought with you, and most of which you hope you will take with you when you leave. We also hope that you'll take with you a much better understanding of what bacteria are, how they evolve, where they're a danger, how we can protect ourselves from those bacteria that are harmful to humans. And with that, I would like to introduce Stuart Levy, who is going to begin the discussion. The format will be each of the speakers will give very short introductory remarks. Then we'll do sort of a second round of short statements by them. Then I'll conduct a little bit of discussion between the two of them, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see friends. My daughter's here. I feel it's family, right? And Kevin wanted sort of an introduction. I wasn't sure what the audience would be like. But essentially, from my standpoint, what we're facing is a global problem. And that problem is the antibiotics that we have developed to treat bacteria, diseases, and actually antimicrobials in general, treat viruses or parasites, are not working as well. In many cases, they're not working at all. And in some instances, we don't have a drug to treat. And so the global nature of it is not only geographically global, but it's also in terms of the different types of antibiotics which are being resisted by different mechanisms. Now, when we talk about bacteria, we often don't think about numbers. And so I thought this would be at least somewhat telling. If you go a few centimeters below the Earth's surface, you can pick up in the surface, so an estimated 26 times 10 to the 28th. That's 1 billion times 1 billion times 1 billion, and then another 10 bacteria. And that's just in the top surface. In the waters, there's 12 times 10. So you got about 40 times 10 to the 28th bacteria. And what about we? Well, the people, there are about 6 billion people on Earth, and we carry 10 to the 13th, 6 times 10 to the 13th bacteria. So in fact, we're not that far off by carrying as much as, about 100,000 10 to the 5th difference. So there's a lot out there, and we're part of it. But as some of you know, we carry more bacteria than we do carry cells of our own body. So if someone came in from an outer planet and looked at what we were and actually saw all the bacteria, they'd think that we were a microbe and that we were probably the shield for the microbe, and they were growing all over us, because that's where they are. Okay, so what are we talking about? Just to give you an idea of what they might look like if you're looking under a microscope at a million magnification. You've got a bacteria that look like tubes, and they're called rods, like Vibrio cholera, the cause of cholera. You've got Staph aureus, the skin bacterium, which is in clusters of spheres. You've got parasites, like the malaria parasites. You've got fungi, Aspergillus, Candida. These are all, just to give you an idea, that these are all microbes, and they're all sharing this Earth with us. And then there are the viruses. Now, the viruses are really 1,000-fold smaller than human cells, and they are smaller than bacteria. And there are two types of viruses. These viruses, they shed from the surface, but they're that's a human or mouse or human cell, but they're extremely small. They're smaller because they actually infect the human cell, and 1,000 can come out of one human cell or one mammalian cell. Bacteria have their own viruses too, which are infinitely smaller. They're called phages. And they're popular because they're the vehicles for exchanging genetic material from one bacterium to another. So this is the background, and we introduced antibiotics, beginning in the 30s. Dr. Tollefson will tell you a little more about it, but it was to control those renegades that got out of the natural environment and came in and caused problems for us. And when we got to develop what was called antibiotics, we really didn't realize the magnitude of the persistence and presence of resistant genes that were in the environment. So actually, I sort of put this down into one simple equation. You have the drug, you have the antibiotic resistance gene out there. If you don't have either of those, you're not going to have a problem. But it turns out that bacteria, who have been around for millennia, I mean, they saw dinosaurs come and go, and now they're facing people. I mean, you know, we got to be careful. So they are not, they are resistant to antibiotics we have not yet discovered. So we shouldn't be surprised we have a new antibiotic and then there's a resistance gene, because they've seen it in some other form. So this is the basis of the resistance problem. Where are we getting the antibiotics? There are about 35 million pounds of antibiotics produced in the United States, not yet the world. And they're used in different forms. Half of them are used for people, and an enormous amount in animals, which you'll hear about later, which is about 17 million, some people put it even higher, pounds, which are given to animals. And 300,000 pounds are sprayed on the fruit trees down in Louisiana, Washington State, Florida. So imagine if you bought your lovely home downstream from a farm that's spraying their apples, you're going to get a little gust of an antibiotic right in your backyard or into your swimming pool. So it's not a good idea, and it's something we're trying to change. What happens, of course, is that the bacteria subjected to these antibiotics, you select those that are resistant, and these are the ones that are passing these TNs around, which are genes for resistance. And that can be anywhere in the world, and that can come back to be anywhere else in the world. Because people are carrying bacteria, as Kevin mentioned, you brought them in, you bring them out, you bring them on airplanes, nobody knows they're there, you drop them at different places. So with 1 million people crossing borders every day, it's pretty easy to see why bacteria that we've discovered in Cleveland actually had their origins in Madrid, Spain, and this goes on and on. So what are the current problems? Well, I'm not going to go through all the names of all of these bacteria, but just to let you know that the MDR stands for multi-drug resistance. So we're in a different era now. We're through with the resistance to the single drugs. We're now facing resistance to multiple drugs, which means that some of this multiplicity can be the 8 to 10 drugs, and you're left with one drug to treat. This is what's happened with tuberculosis. This is what's happened with the E. coli that gives urinary tract infection, Staph aureus, a few others. Certain patients will be unlucky enough to have an organism which is resistant to all of these drugs. The other point I wanted to make here was that, in fact, while the antibiotics were first introduced into hospitals where we saw the resistance first emerge, now the community has its magnitude numbers of resistant bacteria which are causing community-acquired infections, most popular which has been the one for methicillin-resistant or Staph aureus that you hear about in athletes. The one thing, the message, though, I want to leave you with before I turn the program now over to Linda is that they're not magic bullets as they were thought to be. They certainly go in and look for the microbe, and they have to leave us alone. Otherwise, they wouldn't get FDA approval. You see, we don't want it to be toxic. It's fine for cancer drugs, but not for drugs that are going to treat a bacterial infection or a malaria parasite infection. So, but think about it. If they can, they're not going to only take care of the microbe that's causing disease. They're going to have an effect on all the bacteria that we carry on our skin, in our mouth, in our intestinal tract. So there's a huge number of bacteria that are being confronted with antibiotics, and what they end up doing is select out those members that survive, which are resistant, and they can trade their resistances with other bacteria which are causing disease, even though they're not. So they become what we call reservoirs of resistance genes, which can be transferred among bacteria of very different types. So the message I want to leave is bacteria are special. They're different from viruses. We certainly don't make antibiotics to treat viruses, and that's one of the big problems we have facing, is that people expect an antibiotic for a cold, which is a viral illness. That bacteria can get around antibiotics. We can control the so-called resistance if we use antibiotics rationally. Linda?
So Kevin asked me, well, what do we have to treat these infections? Quite a bit. Stuart mentioned that on the advent of penicillin in the 1930s, and we've come quite a way from that. And so in trying to make some sense of this, what I went for is something called the World Health Organization classification of antimicrobials. They did this recently over the past couple of years by convening an expert working group to develop a list of antimicrobials that are used in humans and animals, and they divided them into 3 categories. They were called critically important, highly important, or important. And that came about with a lot of discussion because nobody wanted their drug to be called unimportant. Okay? That's really the only reason they're these phrases. But they are critically important to human medical therapy, and then highly important, and there are specific criteria why they fall in these classifications. And the list is actually used so that we can prioritize mitigation strategies against resistance, where we should take action first, or the biggest problems. But I thought it was an excellent example of showing you what's approved for both humans and animals. These are classes of drugs, of antimicrobial agents. Aminoglycosides, and I'll give you some names that you can know what they are. That macrolides and ketolides, which is sort of maybe most people aren't familiar with those, but erythromycin, you're familiar with that. That's a macrolide. 3rd and 4th generation cephalosporins are very important for human medical therapy. There are currently no approved 4th generation cephalosporins for animals, but there will be soon. It won't take much longer. All of these are approved for animal use, except for the last, drugs for tuberculosis and other mycobacterial diseases. Animals are actually a source of tuberculosis, so we don't treat them. We cull them from the herd. We slaughter them and not let them go into the food supply. But that's the only exception. There are also penicillins. That includes ampicillin, methicillin. There's just this huge list of available antimicrobials in each of these classes. The next class are those highly important. I didn't even put them all down because some of this was done by the World Health Organization, and some of them are going to be so unfamiliar to you. Again, other penicillins, which is why it's on both. 1st and 2nd generation cephalosporins, other aminoglycosides. All these are approved for animals as well as humans. And those that are considered important but not critical have another purpose. One of the strategies behind developing a WHO list was, at the time we were considering, is it possible to find antimicrobials that would not be used in humans that would still be effective in animals, so that we can kind of separate out not antimicrobials in each class, but different classes, so that you have a better chance of not mixing the mechanisms of resistance and so on. And so naturally the human physicians went to the list of those that were important but not critical. Turns out that these are used in animals, and frequently they're used as growth promoters. But I've got a slide later about new antimicrobials in humans that just keep these in mind, okay? The other thing I wanted to do here is to get everybody on the same page, because we will be talking about antibiotics in animals. The public health impact primarily comes from antibiotics in food-producing animals, through the food you eat or through contact and so on. To a lesser extent, companion animals, horses, and so on come into the equation, but not nearly as important or as direct as food-producing animals. So I wanted to tell you that there are basically three ways that animals are treated. One is therapeutic, is to treat ill animals, and it's absolutely necessary. These tend to be treatment of individual animals or segregated in some way in hospital pens, smaller numbers at a time. Another way is to prevent illness in healthy animals. This happens a lot if you're mixing animals, if you're bringing a bunch of animals into a feedlot from a number of different sources. You want to, if you have any illness at all, you'll segregate them, but then also treat the surrounding animals. It's really a contact issue because they can spread the disease. It's also referred to as to control illness in healthy animals. Many of you who are familiar with the issues will recognize these words. And then lastly, antibiotics are used in food animals to promote growth in healthy animals. When we say promote growth, what we mean is to increase feed efficiency. You have to give the animal less feed to produce the same amount of weight gain. So it's a financial consideration. Or sometimes it's referred to as enhancing production by reducing pathogen load. That may or may not be true. We don't have a lot of solid evidence that that actually happens. But that's why antibiotics are currently given to animals to promote growth. And I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. So that's all at the moment. Then the next thing you'd want us to cover is sort of what we've done next, right? So you want me to go on with the human antimicrobials, or would you like to talk again?
You're so good. Why don't you?
Yeah, right, right,
Then
Stuart.
I'm enjoying myself. So
Oh, okay, good. So I'll go
But
on.
I wanted to make one
Go ahead.
point here
Yeah.
that we'll get into, but the last category of drug, that is to promote growth. You use the word healthy animals. That's
Yes.
what they said. But in fact, there is some data to indicate that what you're doing is really treating an underlying low indolent kind of infection, which is preventing the animals from reaching their full weight gain. The other is, and the irony of it all for the audience is this practice started in the 50s, and money was not given to any investigators to find out how it works. So when Linda says maybe or maybe is because we don't have the data. Right. What we do know, however, is that if the animal is germ-free, you raise a germ-free chicken, you raise a germ-free cow, it would be really a pig, and you give antibiotics, there's no effect. So that established at least that this was not a vitamin, because some people in the early days thought that the antibiotics were acting as vitamins, besides the fact that they're working as anti-infectives. But it's quite clear that they are only effective in animals that have bacteria.
Yes, some sort of underlying infection. Some people have claimed that if you have better animal husbandry practices and you decrease the need for the growth promoters and so on, that's never given a chance to be found out, actually.
Except that in the early in the 70s, 60s and 70s, you were seeing 15%, 12 to 15% growth.
Huge.
Now, if you can get 1 or 2%, you're lucky.
Right.
And someone no less known than Frank Perdue gave up using this practice because he said, I never got enough for it, and it wasn't worth the money. So Perdue and many of the chicken producers don't do it. But in the early days, it did work, and I think it was because of what you were mentioning. The hygiene was not what it is now.
Right. They didn't know enough about how to control the the hygiene and how to control access to the farms and so on. It's much more sophisticated now. I was going to say something. Okay, well, let me go on. Because then the next question Kevin said, well, we know now, and you saw from Stuart's slide, some of these horribly resistant infections. I mean, we're talking infections that cannot be treated. We're talking human. Now, you know, where it's important. You need to treat humans, and these things are multiple drug resistance. They now have extreme drug resistant tuberculosis. It just, you know, what are we doing? And sort of the knee-jerk reaction is, well, we need to find another class of antimicrobials. Now, when you saw the lists that I had, those were classes with numerous antimicrobial drugs within each class. So when one got resistant, the resistance tends to follow the class for the most part. But when one got resistant, we got a little bit better, a second-generation cephalosporin, and then that got resistant and so on. So let's just get more drugs, right? Well, there's a problem with that. So I went back over the past 20 years. These are for humans that FDA approved from 87 through 2007. And look at the numbers, first of all, on the left-hand side. Those aren't large. 10 is the top of the scale. The light purple is an additional antibiotic in a class. And then the darker purplish red is actually a new class of antibiotics. So when you look at this, you see, wow, you know, when they finally got their act together, the pharmaceutical companies or FDA, whomever, in the mid-90s, late 90s, they're finally starting to find some new antimicrobial classes. Well, hate to burst your bubble, because look what they did. 1996, that new class was this phosphonic acid that is really sort of an anti-infectant. It's ancient. It's not. It just was never used in humans. Sinercid, Zyvox, you might have heard of some of these. Ketac. These antimicrobial classes are the ones that are much riskier. They have a lower benefit to risk profile, if you will. They're still approvable because a lot of times these drugs are used for the very, very ill patient. But they're not approved for widespread use. These are pretty difficult drugs to tolerate. Also, what I wanted to point out when I mentioned the important class of antimicrobials and how these classes were sort of the odd ones that maybe the animals could use because the humans can't. Well, the animals have been using them for years and years. Now they're coming back. The oxalidones, the cyclic lipopeptides, those come out of those classes of antimicrobials. They're now no longer important. But the resistance genes are already out there. So approving new classes of antimicrobials, and we can get into discussions in detail about what FDA has been trying to do to encourage the development of new antimicrobials. What you've got to keep in mind is that approving a new antimicrobial class, drug in the same class, whatever, does nothing if you don't couple that with some sort of stewardship of the antibiotic. Some sort of restricted use, some sort of restricted in animals, not in humans. We can't just put them out there in the marketplace for widespread use. And unfortunately, the legal basis for how we approve drugs in the United States limits us in that regard.